A desperate voice trembles through the phone line. It's Aisha Nelson. She speaks quickly, her words laced with urgency, fear sharpening every syllable. She tells the 911 operator that her boyfriend, Waverly Dante Hawes, has been threatening her. She's afraid. She needs help. The operator assures her that officers are on their way. The call ends. Hours later, Aisha and her 6-year-old daughter, Harper Gwynn, are dead. When authorities arrive at the home on Burleigh Avenue in Dayton, Ohio, they find a scene of unimaginable horror. 2 bodies, a mother and her child, silenced forever. The person responsible? The same man she had called for help against. The question lingers. Could this have been prevented? A mother pleaded for protection. A little girl had her whole life ahead of her. Yet they are both gone. And the man who took their lives? He wouldn't live to answer for what he had done. This is the story of Aisha Nelson. A story of fear, warning signs, and a system that failed to act in time. On the morning of June 23, 2022, the city of Dayton, Ohio, awoke to news that sent shockwaves through the community. Inside a modest home on Burleigh Avenue, police made a chilling discovery. 2 lifeless bodies. A mother and her daughter. Aisha Nelson, 31 years old, lay still, her life stolen in the very place she had hoped would be a sanctuary. Beside her was the small, fragile form of her 6-year-old daughter, Harper Gwynn, a child who had barely begun to experience the world. To those who knew her, Aisha was a woman who worked hard to create a stable, loving home for Harper. A devoted mother. She carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, always putting her daughter first. Harper was bright, full of life, the kind of child whose laughter could light up a room. She had a future ahead of her, one filled with possibilities that would never be realized. The man responsible for their deaths was someone Aisha once trusted, Waverly Dante Hawes, a name that, until that morning, was known only to family and friends. Now it was etched into the darkest chapter of their lives. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some unknown threat lurking in the shadows. He was Aisha's boyfriend, the man who had shared their home, who had been present in Harper's life. He was the one Aisha had feared in those final hours. She had called for help. She had spoken his name. She had warned of the danger. But no one had stopped him. And now it was too late. Aisha Nelson was more than just another name in a tragic headline. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. She was a woman who worked tirelessly to provide a safe and loving home for her 6-year-old daughter, Harper. To those who knew her, Aisha was kind-hearted and devoted. She had an infectious smile, the kind that made people feel welcomed and valued. Living in Dayton, Ohio, she was part of a community where neighbors recognized one another and where mothers like herself worked hard to build better futures for their children. Her life revolved around Harper. Every decision she made, every sacrifice was for her little girl. Harper was Aisha's world, a bright, curious child with an energy that never seemed to run out. She loved to play, to explore, to ask questions about everything around her. Aisha's biggest dream was to see her daughter grow, to make sure she had opportunities that would lead to a happy, fulfilling life. But behind closed doors, things were not as peaceful as they seemed. Aisha's relationship with Waverly Dante Hawes had not always been toxic. In the beginning, he had been charming, attentive, the kind of man who seemed to understand her struggles and offer her the support she needed. He had become a part of their lives, someone Aisha believed she could rely on. But over time, that support turned into control. The warmth he once showed began to fade, replaced by something much darker. The arguments started small, disagreements over little things that most couples would work through. But soon they escalated. His words became sharper, his anger more unpredictable. Aisha confided in close friends that she felt trapped, that she didn't recognize the man she was with anymore. There were nights when Harper would cling to her mother, sensing the tension that filled the house. Aisha tried to shield her daughter from it, but there was only so much she could do. The most terrifying moments were the ones Aisha kept quiet about. The threats, the way Hawes' temper flared over the slightest inconvenience. She had seen his rage firsthand, and she knew it wasn't just words. He was capable of more, and that fear of what he might do of how far he might go, was what led her to make those desperate 911 calls. Aisha was not alone in her suffering. Across Ohio, domestic violence cases continue to rise. Women like her faced threats behind closed doors every day, many too afraid to speak out. Others ignored when they did. Dayton's Family Justice Center existed to help victims of abuse, offering resources, shelter, and legal assistance to those in danger. But no system is perfect. Not every call is met with immediate action. Not every warning is heeded. On the night of June 23rd, Aisha needed help. She needed the system that was supposed to protect her. But in the end, the help she so desperately sought never arrived in time. The clock had barely struck 1:50 a.m. when Aisha Nelson made the call that should have saved her life. Her voice filled with urgency, carried through the line as she told the Dayton police dispatcher what she had been fearing for so long. Waverly Dante Hawes had threatened her again. This time, she wasn't sure if she and Harper would make it through the night. He had a gun in the house. She was scared. She needed help. Within minutes, two officers, Terrell Moore and Catherine Santos, arrived at the home on Burley Avenue. They found Aisha visibly distressed, her body tense with the weight of everything she had been holding in. She told them that Hawes had been making threats, that she feared what he might do. She needed him gone. Inside, Hawes stood quietly watching. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lunge. He didn't act violently in front of the officers. To them, he wasn't a man in the middle of a violent outburst, just another domestic dispute, one of many they had seen before. And so, they made a decision that would later prove fatal. They told Hawes to stay in the basement for the night, while Aisha remained upstairs with Harper. They did not arrest him. They did not remove him from the home. Most critically, they did not confiscate the firearm. Instead, they left, closing the door on a situation that was far from resolved. Aisha had called for help, but help had left her behind. At some point between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., with no one there to stop him, Hawes made his move. The gun the officers had ignored was now in his hands. Aisha had no way out. Harper, just 6 years old, had no way to protect herself. The final moments in that house remain unknown. Whether Aisha begged, whether Harper cried. Only one thing was certain. When the gunfire stopped, neither of them was left breathing. The house fell silent, and then Hawes disappeared. It wasn't until later that morning, when concern grew for Aisha and Harper, that officers were sent back for a welfare check. This time, there would be no warnings, no second chances. When they stepped inside the home, the horror they had left behind just hours earlier was now inescapable. 2 lives had been stolen in the span of minutes, and the man responsible was already gone. By the time the bodies of Aisha Nelson and Harper Gwynn were discovered, Waverly Dante Hawes was already gone. He had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but devastation. For hours, law enforcement scrambled to track him down. Every moment he remained free felt like an insult to the lives he had taken. The search led investigators south, across state lines, until they finally found him in Alabama. But justice would never be served in a courtroom. Hawes was already dead, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had chosen his own fate before anyone else could. News of his death spread quickly, but it brought no comfort. There was no relief, no real closure. The people who mattered most, the mother who had fought so hard to protect her daughter, the little girl who had her whole life ahead of her, were still gone. And nothing could change that. In Dayton, grief poured through the community like a flood. People who had never even met Aisha and Harper mourned their loss. Candlelight vigils lit the streets as neighbors, friends, and strangers gathered to remember the lives that had been stolen too soon. Their faces were on posters, their names whispered in prayers, their story repeated over and over. But with the grief came something else: anger, frustration, a demand for answers. How could this have happened? Why wasn't Aisha protected when she reached out for help? And most importantly, who was going to be held accountable? The Dayton Police Department could not ignore the questions. An internal investigation was launched into the actions of officers Terrell Moore and Catherine Santos. Every decision they made that night was scrutinized. The results were damning. They had failed. They had ignored protocol. They had left a firearm in the hands of a man who had been reported as a threat. They had walked away when Aisha needed them the most. Their punishment came swiftly. Suspended. Forced to undergo additional training. But for many it wasn't enough. No amount of training would bring Aisha and Harper back. No disciplinary action could undo what had already been done. The tragedy of June 23, 2022, left a scar on Dayton. A reminder of what happens when cries for help are not taken seriously. A mother had done everything she could to protect her child. A little girl had lost her life in a place that should have been safe. And the system, once again, had failed them both. Aisha Nelson and Harper Gwynn were gone. But their story was far from over. Their family refused to let their deaths be just another statistic. Another cautionary tale that would fade into memory. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. And they were willing to fight for it. In the months following the tragedy, Aisha's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Dayton, the police department, and the two officers, Terrell Moore and Catherine Santos. The lawsuit laid everything bare. The negligence, the failures, the missed opportunities to prevent what had happened. Aisha had followed the right steps. She had called for help, trusted the system, and done everything she was supposed to do. And still, she and Harper had been left defenseless. The lawsuit pointed to one undeniable fact. Officers Moore and Santos had failed in their duty. They had not confiscated the firearm. They had not removed Hawes from the home. They had left Aisha and Harper in danger when it was their responsibility to protect them. The family argued that this was not just a mistake, it was negligence, a deadly lapse in judgment that had cost two innocent lives. As the case made its way through the legal system, the Dayton Police Department faced mounting criticism. Public outcry only grew louder. How many more times would this happen? How many more calls for help would be ignored before real change took place? The lawsuit wasn't just about Aisha and Harper. It was about every victim of domestic violence who had been let down by the very institutions meant to protect them. Then, in May 2023, the decision came down. The lawsuit against Officer Santos and Moore was dismissed. A judge ruled that under Ohio law, the officers did not have a legal duty to prevent what had happened. The decision was a crushing blow to Aisha's family. The system had failed Aisha in life, and now it had failed her in death. For many, the ruling was more than just a legal technicality. It was a reminder that victims of domestic violence were still being overlooked, their warnings disregarded. The lawsuit may have been dismissed, but the questions remained. What if the officers had acted differently? What if the system had taken Aisha's fear seriously? What if someone had stepped in before it was too late? There were no answers. Only the painful reality of what had already been lost. A mother who had fought to keep her daughter safe. A child whose future was stolen in an instant. A tragedy that should never have happened. And a justice system that, once again, had turned its back. The dismissal of the lawsuit against Officer Santos and Moore did more than deny Aisha Nelson's family the justice they had hoped for. It reignited a long-standing debate about police response to domestic violence cases. Across the country, law enforcement agencies were being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system designed to protect victims was failing them far too often. In Dayton, the case shed light on serious gaps in police protocols. The officers who responded to Aisha's 911 call had options. They could have removed Waverly Hawes from the home. They could have confiscated the firearm. They could have filed a mandatory report, which might have set off a chain of events to get Aisha the protection she needed. Instead, they chose to do none of those things, and Aisha and Harper paid the price. It wasn't an isolated incident. Studies showed that domestic violence calls were among the most common and most dangerous situations officers responded to. Yet in many cases, these calls were still being treated as routine disturbances rather than the life-threatening emergencies they truly were. Without proper risk assessments and strict adherence to protocol, victims were left vulnerable, often with devastating consequences. In the wake of Aisha's case, discussions about reform gained momentum. Community advocates pushed for stricter enforcement of domestic violence policies, arguing that every threat should be taken seriously. Every protocol followed without exception. Some pointed to the Family Justice Center in Dayton as a step in the right direction. The center was designed to provide survivors with access to legal assistance, counseling, and emergency shelter, all under one roof. But resources like these were only effective if victims were directed to them in time. Aisha had been willing to ask for help. She had reached out to the police, trusting that they would protect her. The fact that she was still left unprotected raised an urgent question. How many more women were out there, living in fear, waiting for help that might never come? The case became a painful but necessary reminder that domestic violence was not just a private issue. It was a matter of public safety. Every decision made by law enforcement in those critical moments could mean the difference between life and death. And until real changes were made, until every officer understood the weight of those decisions, the cycle of preventable tragedies would continue. Aisha Nelson and Harper Gwynn should still be here. Their story is not just about one tragic night. It's about a system that failed them, a system that continues to fail so many others. This case forces us to ask difficult but necessary questions. How many lives could be saved if law enforcement treated every domestic violence call as an emergency it truly is? What policies need to change to ensure officers don't leave victims in danger? What consequences should there be when authorities fail to act? The discussion doesn't end here. Domestic violence is a crisis that extends far beyond this one case. It affects families, communities, and entire societies. So what can we do? How can we support those who are trapped in abusive relationships? What steps can we take to make sure that when someone calls for help, they actually receive it? If this story moved you, don't let the conversation stop now. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you or someone you know ever faced a similar situation? What do you think needs to change? Your voice matters. And raising awareness is the first step toward real change. If you found this case important, consider liking and sharing this video to help bring attention to these critical issues. And if you want to hear more in-depth discussions on the stories that matter, don't forget to subscribe. Together, we can shine a light on the injustices that too often go unnoticed.